welcome to the Logistics Point interviews. I'm joined by Tim Robinson, who is the CEO of Doddle, and we're going to talk about returns, retail, and also COVID, unsurprisingly. Tim, thank you very much for joining me.
No, thank you, Nick. It's great to be here. We appreciate the invite.
During COVID, and I think it's still going on, we spoke about how e-commerce is booming and orders are going up. Presumably, this also meant that returns were going up. What were the problems there for retailers?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. You know, the inevitable consequence of an increase in online orders is that there is a subsequent increase in returns. And I think, you know, what we've seen over the last couple of years is the proportionality of returns to outbound orders has also gone up, you know, because I think through phases of the pandemic, consumers' ability to shop online in some ways was respite from the solitude of lockdown. Retailers obviously had to rethink their rules around returns, you know, insisting on a 14 or 28 day returns window when some of those consumers are locked down. So can't leave the house, can't get to the post office, can't get to a post box. That's particularly relevant for omni-channel retailers who might have seen high proportions of their returns going back to their own stores. So we saw some eye-watering stats during the pandemic. I know that ASOS posted some results talking about extraordinary profits in the previous quarter, but erring caution on the behalf of analysts that they knew that there was going to be a large sort of volume of returns coming back later. I think the certainty and predictability of returns has been impacted through the pandemic. But ultimately, I would say, you know, smooth returns, the ease of returns, free returns has been one of the driving forces behind e-commerce continuing to grow during the pandemic. So creating restrictions almost certainly would be a weight around the necks of consumers, and thankfully retailers haven't done so. They've sought to make returns much easier.
And the other thing is that now that we know more about COVID, we know that we don't necessarily have to sanitize everything that we touch. Has this really had a systematic impact on how returns were handled and are still being handled?
Yeah, definitely. There was a huge amount of uncertainty in the first 6, 9, 12 months of the pandemic, you know, around if you receive a return from a consumer, how do you handle that return? Can it be reprocessed? Can it be resold? Is it about repackaging the item, or is it fundamentally the item becomes waste? You know, some of the larger online fashion retailers actually took the decision to extend their returns windows to 12 months because that allowed them ultimately to come to some conclusion in that regard, either create new processes or ultimately new returns rules. The majority of returns are now back to being handled in broadly the same way. And, you know, we haven't created a sort of tsunami of waste that wasn't there previously, you know, so waste and recycling still remains a big challenge for the sector, but I don't think it's become the big kind of the spectre that it was potentially looking like it was going to be.
One of the things we talk about with returns is how unsustainable it is. Do you think that it is getting better?
Technology is being brought to bear to drive up the sustainability of returns. You know, ultimately, what are we trying to do? Fundamentally, we're trying to reduce the overall number and proportion of returns. You know, that when I say we, I mean the collective we in the supply chain. I think proportionally around the world, you know, retailers using digital returns platforms that benefit from all that data and insight would be a very small proportion. But, you know, you look at the big guys, look at Amazon, you know, their platform is making very intelligent decisions about returns day in, day out. You know, they were really the pioneers of giving the consumer the opportunity to keep the item, re-gift the item, rather than send it back through a unsustainable return supply chain. I think we'll see more and more of that as time goes on, but it's still a relatively small proportion. But
can you give us a bit of an overview of what happens when an item, customer wants to return an item and Doddle is in place?
We give the consumer a really easy, intuitive way of what we would call initiating a return. So we pull the order number and the order data out of the retailer's back-end website. So in the most part, a consumer only has to click through their receipt email or text message to start a return, rather than having to put all their data and their information in. We make it really quick and really simple. But once the consumer is in, we want to gather as much data about that return as possible. Why is it being returned? What are the characteristics of that item that mean the consumer doesn't want to keep it? But having done so, the rules engine that sits behind our returns platform comes into play. So what that rules engine might do is it might offer a different return solution, returns option for a low value item or a low weight item. It will tell a consumer if that item is outside of the returns window. So you're not going to get a refund, but you might be given store credit. So it can start to change behavior in that regard. And ultimately, the most important thing is it will consign that item to one of 3 or 4 different outbound supply chains. So at the point at which the consumer drops that return into a post office or into a PUDO location or a locker, the right label gets printed, because if it's going to resale, you want that resale label printed immediately, so it goes straight back into stock, and the item is then digitally put back into stock. If the item actually is going to be liquidated, is going to be sold to the secondary market, then it will go straight to that provider, instead of going back to a return center, rehandled, rebadged, sent off to a third party. It will go straight there, so it will cut out that unnecessary leg. And in the event that the item needs to be recycled, again, it will go straight to the recycling partner. So going to multiple different delivery addresses.
Does it save costs, or does it save time, or both?
Both, ultimately. Logistics, time is cost. So if you can save time, you can save cost. I think there's a couple of things that stand out, though. The cost element for me around returns is the amount of unnecessary miles that are consumed by items, individual items in the returns process now, where there are relatively kind of analog returns processes. Consumer fills out that form, puts the label on the box, sticks it in a post office, and it will go all the way back to a return center. Here in Europe, that can be across 3 different borders. For somebody to open that item and realize it should be going to a liquidator, which is 20 miles back the opposite direction near the consumer. So there's a huge amount of wasted miles goes on in that whole process, because the first time that a retailer gets to have a look at that return is back at a return center somewhere in the middle of Europe. So, but I would say the thing that's becoming more and more of a focus of the really kind of switched on merchants is the quicker I can get that return back, both digitally, i.e. I know it's coming back, I can put it up for sale. So I can make sure that item is available for sale again, it's in inventory. And then the quicker I can get it back actually into a distribution center so I can re-fulfill that item, the better.
Well, Tim, thank you very much for your time. And as usual, people can learn more in the description down below. Thank you.
Thanks very much.